In the dusty outskirts of Cedar Ridge, two broken souls are about to discover that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. Sarah Matthews has nothing left. No money, no home, and barely enough hope to keep her young son fed for another day. She's ready to surrender to despair when fate leads her to the doorstep of Jake Morrison, a weathered cowboy whose own heart carries scars deeper than the canyons surrounding his modest ranch. Jake has spent years learning that life's cruelest lessons often prepare us for its greatest blessings. When he opens his door to this desperate woman and her frightened child, he doesn't see charity cases. He sees kindred spirits who understand loss. What neither of them realizes is that their meeting will transform not just their lives, but their very understanding of what it means to have faith in tomorrow. But can two people who've lost everything really save each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered floorboards of Jake Morrison's kitchen as he stood at the window, watching the mist rise from the pasture beyond. His calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the same one he'd used for coffee every morning for the past 15 years. The ritual never changed. Black coffee, no sugar, strong enough to wake the dead. At 52, Jake had learned that consistency brought a kind of peace that the world outside his ranch rarely offered. His modest home reflected the man himself, functional, unpretentious, built to last. The kitchen table bore the scars of countless meals eaten alone, its pine surface worn smooth by years of use. A simple wooden cross hung above the doorway, hand-carved during one of those long winter evenings when the silence grew too heavy, even for a man accustomed to solitude. The cross wasn't ornate or precious, just pine wood shaped by patient hands, sanded smooth, and stained the color of autumn leaves. It reminded him daily that faith didn't need to be complicated to be real. Jake had purchased the ranch 23 years ago with money saved from his years working oil rigs in Texas. The two-bedroom house wasn't much to look at then, and it wasn't much to look at now, but it was his. 300 acres of Wyoming grassland stretched in every direction, bordered by mountains that change color with the seasons. He ran a modest herd of cattle, enough to make a living, not enough to make him rich. Rich wasn't something Jake Morrison aspired to be. The walls of his home told the story of a man who valued substance over show. Photographs of his parents sat on the mantelpiece, their faces frozen in time from a church picnic 30 years past. His mother's recipe box occupied a place of honor on the kitchen counter, its contents yellowed with age and spotted with decades of use. These recipes had fed his family through good times and lean ones, and now they fed only him. The irony wasn't lost on him that he still cooked as if expecting company, though visitors were rare and overnight guests rarer still. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Up at 5:30, coffee and a glance at the weather, then out to tend the animals. The cattle knew his schedule better than most people knew theirs. By 6:15, he'd checked the water troughs, counted heads, and assessed the condition of his fences. The physical work suited him, honest labor that produced tangible results. A fence mended stayed mended, cattle fed stayed fed. Problems on a ranch had solutions, unlike the problems that had driven him to seek solitude in the first place. The town of Cedar Ridge lay 15 miles to the east, connected to Jake's ranch by a gravel road that turned to mud when it rained, and dust when it didn't. The town itself hadn't changed much in the 2 decades since Jake had arrived. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, flanked by the kinds of businesses that served ranchers and their families. Murphy's General Store, the Cedar Ridge Diner, Hendricks's Feed and Supply, and the First National Bank. The post office shared space, with the barbershop and the gas station doubled as the town's primary gathering place for news and gossip. Jake made the trip to town twice a week, Wednesdays for supplies, Sundays for church. He wasn't what you'd call a social man, but he believed in community responsibility. He served on the volunteer fire department, contributed to the church fund for families in need, and helped his neighbors during calving season or when the weather turned nasty. People respected Jake Morrison, even if they didn't know him well. He was the kind of man you could count on to keep his word and mind his own business, qualities that were increasingly rare in a world that seemed to value neither. The townsfolk had long since stopped trying to set him up with available women. There had been a few over the years: the new school teacher, a widow who'd moved from Denver, the bank president's divorced daughter. Jake had been polite but distant, accepting invitations to church potlucks and community events, but never allowing relationships to develop beyond cordial friendship. He'd loved once, deeply and completely, and the loss had taught him that some wounds never fully heal. Better to live alone than risk that kind of pain again. But loneliness was a different kind of pain, one that crept up slowly and settled into a man's bones like winter cold. Jake felt it most acutely in the evenings when the work was done, and the silence stretched endlessly ahead. He'd taken to whittling then, his hands shaping pieces of wood while his mind wandered paths it was better not to follow. The simple wooden cross above his kitchen door was one such product of those quiet hours, carved from a piece of oak that had fallen during a storm. The work soothed him, the repetitive motions as meditative as prayer. 60 miles away, in a rusted pickup truck parked behind Murphy's General Store, Sarah Matthews stared at her reflection in the cracked side mirror and wondered when she'd started looking so old. At 34, she felt ancient, worn down by circumstances that seemed determined to grind her into dust. The woman, looking back at her, bore little resemblance to the optimistic young wife and mother she'd been just 2 years ago. That woman had believed in happy endings and the fundamental goodness of the world. This woman knew better. Her son Tommy slept fitfully in the passenger seat, his 7-year-old frame curled around a threadbare teddy bear that had seen better days. The bear, named Mr. Buttons for reasons Tommy could no longer remember, was one of the few remnants of their previous life. Everything else, the house, the furniture, the photo albums, the comfortable routines of middle-class existence, had been stripped away piece by piece over the past 18 months. Sarah's husband, David, had died suddenly of a heart attack at 36, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt and a life insurance policy that proved worthless due to a technicality the lawyers explained in language she couldn't understand. The bank had been patient for a while, but patience had limits, and those limits had been reached. The eviction notice was folded in her purse, along with $17.32, everything she had left in the world. The truck, a 1987 Ford with more rust than paint, had belonged to her father-in-law. It barely ran, but it had gotten them this far. Cedar Ridge wasn't their destination so much as the place where the truck had finally given up, coughing and shuddering to a stop behind the general store like an old horse that knew its time had come. Sarah had managed to coax it far enough, off the main road, to avoid drawing attention, but she knew their situation was temporary at best. She'd spent the last of their money on a can of soup and a loaf of bread from Murphy's store, sharing it with Tommy while he chattered about the adventure they were having. At 7, he still believed his mother could fix anything, solve any problem, make everything right again. His faith in her was both a blessing and a burden she wasn't sure she could carry much longer. The approaching autumn had turned the Wyoming landscape into a palette of gold and amber, beautiful in a way that made Sarah's chest ache. She'd grown up believing that beautiful places were where good things happened, where families thrived and dreams came true. Now beauty seemed like mockery, a reminder of everything she'd lost and everything Tommy would never have. She'd been sitting in the truck for 3 hours, watching the people of Cedar Ridge go about their daily business, wondering if any of them had ever felt this desperate. The town seemed prosperous in a quiet way. Pickup trucks that weren't held together with hope and duct tape, children who looked well-fed and warm, adults who moved with the confidence of people who knew where they'd sleep that night. Sarah had noticed one man in particular, a tall figure in worn jeans and a faded blue shirt, who'd emerged from the general store carrying supplies. There was something about the way he moved, purposeful but unhurried, confident without being arrogant, that drew her attention. He'd loaded his purchases into a clean pickup truck and driven away without seeming to notice her broken-down vehicle or its occupants. She watched him go and felt a stab of envy for whatever certainty guided his steps. Night was coming, and with it the bitter cold of high-altitude autumn. Tommy would need warmth and shelter, and Sarah was running out of options. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, but fear kept her frozen in place. Fear of rejection, of pity, of the authorities who might decide she was an unfit mother and take Tommy away. The teddy bear in Tommy's arms had been his constant companion since his father's death, and Sarah clung to the hope it represented, that some things endure, that love leaves traces that outlast loss. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would swallow her pride and ask for help. Not charity. She would find a way to earn whatever assistance she received, but the kind of basic human kindness that she prayed still existed in the world. Tomorrow, she decided, she would stop hiding behind the general store and step into the light, no matter what that might bring. The wooden cross above Jake Morrison's kitchen door had been carved from a tree that survived lightning strikes, drought, and winter storms before finally falling. Jake often thought there was a lesson in that, about endurance, about the strength that comes from weathering life's inevitable hardships. What he didn't know, as he settled into his evening routine 15 miles away, was that his own understanding of endurance was about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. The cold came down from the mountains like a living thing, seeping through the truck's rusted seams and settling into Sarah's bones. She'd wrapped Tommy in every piece of clothing they had, but his small body still shivered against her as they huddled together in the cab. The threadbare teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, lay pressed between them, its worn fabric a testament to better times when such things had seemed permanent. "Mama, I'm cold," Tommy whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. His voice carried the particular quality of a child trying to be brave, and it broke Sarah's heart more than any complaint would have. "I know, sweetheart. We'll figure something out." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them. They'd been figuring something out for months now, and each solution had proven temporary at best. The truck's heater had died somewhere outside. Laramie, along with what remained of their hope for an easy journey west. Sarah pulled Tommy closer, feeling the sharp ridge of his ribs through his thin jacket. When had he gotten so skinny? When had she stopped noticing the gradual disappearance of his childhood roundness? The questions tormented her as she stared through the cracked windshield at the distant lights of Cedar Ridge. Such a small town, yet it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did them. The night deepened, and with it came a bone-deep cold that made Tommy's shivering worse. Sarah made a decision born of desperation rather than wisdom. She started the truck, coaxing the reluctant engine to life long enough to drive to the edge of town, where she'd seen a small park earlier. At least there, she reasoned, they'd be closer to help if something went wrong. The truck died again, just as they reached the park, this time with a mechanical wheeze that sounded final. Sarah tried the ignition repeatedly, but the engine refused to turn over. They were stranded truly and completely, with nowhere to go and no way to get there. "Mama?" Tommy's voice was smaller now, fear creeping in around the edges of his carefully maintained courage. "It's okay, baby. We'll sleep here tonight, and tomorrow everything will be better." Another hollow promise. But what else could she offer? The truth that she had no plan, no resources, and no realistic hope of improving their situation wasn't something a 7-year-old should have to carry. They slept fitfully, if at all. Sarah dozed in brief intervals, jerking awake each time. Tommy's shivering intensified, or when the wind rattled the truck's loose panels. By dawn, she knew with sick certainty that something was wrong. Tommy's forehead burned with fever, and his breathing had taken on a shallow, labored quality that terrified her. "Tommy, wake up, sweetheart." She shook him gently, fighting down panic when his eyes opened, but failed to focus properly. The fever had spiked during the night, and his skin felt hot and dry despite the cold air around them. Sarah's nursing training from years ago kicked in, and she recognized the signs of dehydration and exposure. Tommy needed medical attention, warmth and fluids, none of which she could provide in their current circumstances. Pride and fear warred in her chest as she considered their options. She could drive to the hospital in the county seat 30 miles away if the truck would start. She could knock on doors in town, hoping someone would take pity on a desperate stranger. Or she could sit here and watch her son get worse while she paralyzed herself with indecision. The choice was made for her when Tommy began to shiver uncontrollably, his small body racked with chills despite the fever. Sarah tried the truck one more time, flooding the engine in her desperation, but it remained stubbornly silent. With no other options, she gathered Tommy in her arms, shocked by how light he felt, and began walking toward the lights of town. The main street of Cedar Ridge stretched before them, quiet in the early morning light. Most of the businesses were still closed, their windows dark and unwelcoming. Sarah's legs shook with exhaustion and fear as she carried Tommy past the general store, the diner, the bank. Where could she go? Who would help a stranger with a sick child and no money to pay for treatment? She was standing in the middle of Main Street, swaying with fatigue and uncertainty, when she heard the sound of an approaching truck. The clean pickup she'd noticed the day before pulled to a stop beside her, and the tall man in the faded blue shirt stepped out. Up close, she could see the concern in his weathered features, the way his eyes immediately assessed Tommy's condition, with the practiced gaze of someone who'd dealt with emergencies before. "Ma'am, is your boy all right?" His voice was deep and calm, carrying the kind of authority that came from experience rather than bluster. He didn't wait for her answer before moving closer, his trained eye taking in Tommy's flushed face and labored breathing. "He's sick," Sarah managed, her voice breaking on the words. I can't." The rest of the sentence dissolved into exhausted sobs. She'd held herself together through months of loss and hardship, but the sight of this stranger's immediate concern broke something loose inside her chest. "Let me help." Jake Morrison spoke the words simply, without drama or conditions. He reached for Tommy, and Sarah found herself releasing her son into the arms of a man she didn't know. Something in Jake's manner, the gentle certainty of his movements, the way Tommy instinctively relaxed against his broad chest, told her she'd made the right choice. "My truck's right here. We'll get him warm and fed, then figure out what comes next." Jake was already moving toward his vehicle, Tommy cradled securely in his arms. "You look like you could use some warming up yourself." Sarah followed on unsteady legs, too grateful and exhausted to question this unexpected salvation. Jake settled Tommy on the truck's bench seat, cranking the heat to full and tucking a clean blanket around the boy's small frame. The warmth hit Sarah like a physical blow, reminding her just how cold she'd been. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said as he started the truck. "Live about 15 miles out of town. Got a guest room and a kitchen that works. Your boy needs both." "Sarah." "Matthews," she whispered, "this is Tommy. We don't have any money to pay you." Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression gentle but firm. "Didn't ask for money. Asked if you needed help, different things entirely." The drive to Jake's ranch passed in a blur of relief and anxiety. Tommy dozed fitfully against Sarah's shoulder, his fever still high, but his breathing easier in the truck's warmth. Sarah stared out at the rolling grassland, wondering what kind of man offered shelter to complete strangers without question or expectation. Jake's house appeared modest but welcoming, its windows glowing warmly in the morning light. He carried Tommy inside, while Sarah followed, overwhelmed by the simple comfort of heated air and the smell of coffee from an automatically timed pot. The living room was spare but clean. dominated by a stone fireplace and comfortable furniture that showed signs of long use. "Guest room's through here," Jake said, leading them down a short hallway. The room was small but spotless, with a double bed covered in a faded quilt and a window that looked out over the pasture. "Bathrooms across the hall. There's aspirin in the medicine cabinet and clean towels in the closet." He settled Tommy on the bed with practiced efficiency, checking the boy's temperature with the back of his hand. "Fever's high but not dangerous yet. Fluids and rest should help. I'll fix some broth." Sarah sank into the chair beside the bed, watching this stranger tend to her son with the kind of careful attention she'd associated with family. "Why are you doing this?" Jake paused in the doorway, considering the question seriously. "Because it needs doing," he said finally. "Because that boy needs help, and you look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders for too long. Because sometimes we get chances to do right by people, and it's a sin to waste them." He left them alone then, but Sarah could hear him moving around the kitchen, the sound of soup cans opening and a kettle being filled. Mr. Buttons sat propped against the pillow beside Tommy's flushed face, a silent witness to this unexpected kindness. Sarah picked up the worn teddy bear and held it close, feeling for the first time in months that perhaps they weren't completely alone in the world after all. Sarah woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of voices from the kitchen, one deep and measured, the other high and animated. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was. Then memory flooded back. The cold night, Tommy's fever, and Jake Morrison's unexpected kindness. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains, and she realized she'd slept more deeply than she had in months. She found Tommy sitting at Jake's kitchen table, color returned to his cheeks, chattering about the horses he could see through the window. Jake stood at the stove, listening with the patient attention of a man accustomed to solitude who found genuine pleasure in a child's enthusiasm. "Mama!" Tommy's face lit up when he saw her. "Jake says I can help feed the horses later. Did you know they each have names? There's Duke and Penny and Star has a white mark on her forehead that looks just like a star," Sarah finished, unable to suppress a smile at her son's excitement. It had been too long since she'd seen him this animated about anything. "Coffee's fresh," Jake said without turning from the stove. "Eggs'll be ready in a minute." He spoke with the easy casualness of a man who'd been making breakfast for guests his entire life. Though Sarah suspected that wasn't the case, she accepted the steaming mug he offered, inhaling the rich aroma. Real coffee, strong and black, not the instant powder they'd been rationing. "You didn't have to." "Course I did." Jake's interruption was gentle but firm. "Boy was hungry, and you looked like you could use some real food." He slid a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast in front of her, the portion generous enough for 2 people. Sarah stared at the food, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. When had anyone last cooked for her? When had she sat at a table that wasn't wobbling on uneven legs or sticky with the residue of 100 hurried meals? The simple normalcy of it, the clean plates, the checked tablecloth, the way Jake moved efficiently around his own kitchen, felt like a glimpse of a life she'd forgotten existed. "I should check on our truck," she said, though the words felt hollow. They both knew the truck wasn't going anywhere. "Already did," Jake replied, settling into his chair with his own plate. "Radiators cracked, and the engine's seen better days. Pete at the garage'll take a look, but—" He trailed off, his meaning clear. Sarah nodded, fighting down the familiar panic that rose whenever another piece of their precarious existence crumbled away. "I'll figure something out. No hurry." Jake's words were matter of fact, not patronizing. "Room's yours as long as you need it." After breakfast, Sarah insisted on cleaning the dishes despite Jake's protests. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions while she watched him through the window, showing Tommy how to scatter feed for the chickens. The boy's laughter carried on the morning air, a sound she'd almost forgotten. Jake's kitchen revealed more about the man with each detail she noticed. The worn recipe box on the counter was filled with cards written in feminine handwriting. His mother's, she guessed. The spice rack was organized with military precision, but the herbs were clearly used, not just for show. A small wooden cross hung above the door, hand-carved with the kind of patient craftsmanship that spoke of long winter evenings and steady hands. The cross drew her attention repeatedly as she worked. It wasn't ornate or expensive, just honest. Wood-shaped, with obvious care, something about its simplicity appealed to her. Faith without pretense, hope carved from whatever materials were at hand. She found herself wondering about the man who'd made it, about the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from everything in this house. When Jake and Tommy returned from their tour of the ranch, both were dusty and grinning. Tommy launched into a detailed description of the cattle, the barn cats, and the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. Jake listened with genuine interest, occasionally adding details or answering questions with the patience of a natural. "Teacher, can we stay forever, Mama?" Tommy asked as Sarah helped him wash his hands. The innocent question hit her like a physical blow, both for its impossibility and for how much she wished it were possible. "We're just visiting, sweetheart," she managed. "Jake has his own life." "But there's lots of room," Tommy protested. "And he said I could learn to ride Duke if I get taller." Jake appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Boy's got a natural way with animals," he said to Sarah. "Horses took to him right away." The afternoon settled into an easy rhythm. Jake worked on fence repairs, while Sarah and Tommy explored the immediate area around the house. She was amazed by the quiet orderliness of everything. Tools returned to their proper places, gates latched securely, no debris or neglect anywhere she looked. This was the home of a man who took responsibility seriously, who understood that maintenance prevented larger problems down the road. Tommy discovered a family of barn cats and spent an hour coaxing them out of hiding with patient stillness that reminded Sarah of his father. David had possessed that same gentle persistence, that instinctive understanding of how to make frightened creatures feel safe. The memory brought both comfort and pain, as thoughts of David always did. When Jake came in for lunch, he found Sarah attempting to organize his pantry as a way of feeling useful. "You don't need to do that," he said, though his tone held no criticism. "I need to do something," Sarah replied, her hands still sorting canned goods. "I can't just take your hospitality without giving something back." Jake studied her for a moment, seeming to understand the pride behind her words. "Fair enough. Pantry could use organizing, and that fence gate by the south pasture's been sticking. Know anything about hinges?" Sarah felt a flush of gratitude for his tact. He was offering her work without making it feel like charity. "I've fixed a few hinges in my time." "Good. We'll tackle it after lunch." They worked together that afternoon, Sarah holding boards while Jake secured new hinges, their conversation flowing naturally between practical matters and gentle probing of each other's histories. Jake learned that Sarah had been a nurse before Tommy was born, that she'd grown up on a small farm in Nebraska, that she could handle tools and wasn't afraid of hard work. Sarah discovered that Jake had worked construction before buying the ranch, that he'd learned carpentry from his father, that he approached problems with methodical patience rather than frustration. Tommy helped by fetching tools and offering running commentary on everything they did. His presence seemed to ease the potential awkwardness between two adults who were essentially strangers thrown together by circumstance. The boys' innocent acceptance of their situation made it feel less temporary, less desperate. As evening approached, Jake prepared another generous meal, refusing Sarah's offers to cook. "You're still recovering," he said when she protested. "Plenty of time for shared kitchen duties later." The word "later" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Neither was ready to examine too closely. Sarah helped set the table instead, noting how Jake automatically set 3 places, how he'd already adjusted his routines to accommodate guests he'd known for less than 24 hours. After dinner, they sat on the front porch while Tommy played with a wooden toy horse Jake had carved years earlier. The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above them, stars beginning to emerge in the deepening blue. The silence was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of quiet that comes when people feel no pressure to fill every moment with conversation. "Thank you," Sarah said finally, "for all of this. I know you didn't sign up for—" Stop. Jake's interruption was gentle but final. "You're here because you needed help, and I was in a position to give it. That's how things should work." Sarah looked at this man who spoke of kindness as if it were a simple duty rather than an extraordinary gift. In her experience, people who helped others usually wanted something in return: gratitude, recognition, or favors to be collected later. Jake Morrison seemed genuinely content to offer shelter and ask for nothing but the opportunity to be useful. As they watched Tommy chase fireflies in the growing dusk, Sarah allowed herself to imagine just for a moment what it would be like to stay, to belong somewhere again, to have routines and security and a place at a kitchen table that didn't wobble. The fantasy was dangerous in its appeal, but for tonight, she let herself hold it close like a child holds a favorite toy, knowing it wasn't real, but finding comfort in its possibility. 3 days into their stay, Sarah made the walk into town, leaving Tommy under Jake's watchful care. The decision hadn't been easy. She'd never left her son with a stranger before, but Jake's patient competence had earned her trust in ways she was only beginning to understand. Tommy had been delighted by the prospect of spending the morning learning to groom the horses, and Jake had accepted the responsibility with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything else. The Cedar Ridge diner occupied a corner building on Main Street, its windows facing both the morning sun and the steady stream of ranchers who made up its primary clientele. Sarah pushed through the glass door, steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. She needed work, and she needed it immediately. The owner, a weathered woman named Dolores, with steel-gray hair and knowing eyes, looked up from the coffee pot she was refilling. "You're the one staying out at Jake's place," she said without preamble. It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in a town this size. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Sarah Matthews. I'm looking for work." Dolores studied her with the frank assessment of someone who'd hired and fired dozens of waitresses over the years. "Experience? Some, but I learn fast, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "References?" Sarah's heart sank. She had no references. No employment history she could provide without revealing the extent of her desperation. My situation is complicated." "Most are." Dolores set down the coffee pot and crossed her arms. "Jake Morrison vouched for you. Said you were good people who'd hit a rough patch. That's reference enough for me." Relief flooded through Sarah so suddenly she felt lightheaded. "He spoke to you?" "Yesterday. Didn't ask me to hire you, mind. Jake's. Not the type to presume. Just mentioned you might be looking for work and that you could be trusted." Dolores gestured toward the dining room, where several tables of ranchers were finishing their breakfast. "Can you start now? Morning rush is my busiest time." Sarah nodded eagerly, already reaching for the apron Dolores offered. The work was familiar, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, clearing tables. But the rhythm of the diner was different from the hospital cafeteria where she'd worked briefly after David's death. Here conversations were unhurried. Customers knew each other by name, and the pace allowed for genuine interaction rather than rushed efficiency. The men seemed initially skeptical of the newcomer, but Sarah's competence and quiet dignity gradually won them over. She remembered orders without writing them down, anticipated needs before they were voiced, and treated every customer with the same respectful attention, regardless of whether they left tips or merely exact change. By noon, word had spread that Jake Morrison's houseguest was working at the diner. Sarah found herself fielding curious but polite questions about her background, her plans, and her relationship to Jake. She answered carefully, revealing little but offending no one, aware that her responses would be dissected and discussed. Long after she'd moved on to the next table, "Jake's a good man," volunteered Tom Hendricks, who owned the feed store and had known Jake for 20 years. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he'll be the first one to help when trouble comes calling. Fixed my barn roof last spring when I threw out my back." Similar testimonials came throughout the day, painting a picture of Jake Morrison as a man who lived his values quietly but consistently. Sarah learned that he'd paid medical bills for families in crisis, donated cattle to church fundraisers, and worked volunteer shifts at the fire station without ever seeking recognition. The Jake these people described matched the man she was coming to know, but hearing about his character from others somehow made his kindness to her and Tommy feel less like charity and more like the natural expression of who he was. When her shift ended, Dolores counted out her tips and wages, more money than Sarah had held in months. "You did good today," the older woman said. "Regular shift starts at 6 if you want it, 7 days a week if you need it." Sarah accepted gratefully, knowing that steady work was the first step toward rebuilding some kind of independence. She wouldn't be able to support herself and Tommy on diner wages alone, but it was a beginning. The walk back to Jake's ranch gave her time to process the day's revelations. She'd found work, proven she could still function in the world, and begun to understand her place in the community's careful hierarchy. More importantly, she'd started to see Jake through other people's eyes, and what she saw made her feelings toward him both clearer and more complicated. She found Jake and Tommy in the barn, where Jake was teaching the boy to milk Bessie, the ranch's lone dairy cow. Tommy's face was scrunched in concentration as he tried to coordinate the unfamiliar hand motions, while Jake offered patient guidance and encouragement. "Mama!" Tommy called when he spotted her. "Look, I'm getting milk!" The thin stream hitting the bucket was evidence of his success, and his pride was infectious. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Sarah settled on a hay bale to watch, touched by the easy rapport between man and boy. Jake caught her eye over Tommy's head and smiled, the first unguarded expression she'd seen from him. "How did it go?" he asked, as Tommy continued his determined milking. "Dolores hired me. Said you'd spoken to her." Jake shrugged, suddenly focused on adjusting Tommy's grip. "Mentioned you might be looking for work. Figured she could use the help." "You didn't have to do that." Didn't do anything but tell the truth. His response was matter of fact, but Sarah caught the slight flush that colored his neck. Jake Morrison wasn't comfortable with gratitude, she realized. He preferred to help quietly and move on. That evening, they established a new routine. Sarah cooked dinner from ingredients Jake provided, insisting that if she was going to stay, she needed to contribute something beyond her meager wages. Jake protested initially but relented when he saw how important it was to her sense of dignity. She used recipes from Jake's mother's collection, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of preparation and the satisfaction of feeding people she cared about. The recipes themselves told stories, notes in the margins about family preferences, modifications for special occasions, ingredients adjusted for lean times and abundant ones. This was the record of a woman who'd fed her family with love and creativity, and Sarah felt honored to continue that tradition, even temporarily. After dinner, Jake retreated to the front porch with a piece of wood and his carving knife. Sarah watched through the window as his hands shaped the timber with patient strokes, creating something beautiful from raw material. There was a meditative quality to his work, a peaceful focus that spoke of a man comfortable with solitude, but not necessarily wedded to it. Tommy fell asleep early, exhausted from his day of new experiences. Sarah tucked him in, noticing how he clutched Mr. Buttons close, but also how easily he'd adapted to this new environment. Children were resilient in ways adults couldn't be, accepting change and finding joy in unexpected places. When she joined Jake on the porch, he looked up from his carving, a small bird taking shape under his skilled hands. "For Tommy," he explained, simply. Figured he might like something to remember the ranch by. The casual assumption that they would eventually leave hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. Of course they would leave. This was temporary shelter, not a permanent arrangement. But somewhere in the comfortable routine of the past few days, she'd begun to forget that basic truth. "It's beautiful," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "You're very talented." Jake's hands stilled for a moment. Keeps the fingers. "Busy?" he said, deflecting the compliment. "Learned from my father. He could carve anything. Birds, horses, little dolls for my sister." "You have a sister?" "Had. Cancer took her 10 years ago." The words were spoken simply, without self-pity, but Sarah heard the old grief beneath them. "I'm sorry." Jake nodded, his hands resuming their careful work. "She would have liked you," he said after a moment. "Would have liked Tommy, too. Always said this place needed the sound of children's laughter." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, each lost in their own thoughts about loss and possibility, about the strange circumstances that had brought them together and the uncertain future that lay ahead. In his lap, the wooden bird continued to take shape, a small gift carved with patience and offered with hope. 2 weeks into their stay, Sarah discovered Jake's workshop quite by accident. She'd been looking for a screwdriver to tighten a loose cabinet handle when she pushed open what she'd assumed was a storage closet. Instead, she found herself standing in a room that revealed an entirely different side of the man who'd taken them in. The workshop was small, but meticulously organized, with hand tools arranged on pegboards and larger equipment positioned for maximum efficiency. But it was the finished pieces that took her breath away. Carved animals so lifelike they seemed ready to move, decorative boxes with intricate inlay work, and furniture that combined function with artistry. A half-finished rocking chair sat in the corner, its curves graceful and proportions perfect. "Find what you were looking for." Jake's voice from the doorway made her jump. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. I was just looking for a screwdriver and—" She gestured helplessly at the room around her. "Jake, these are incredible. You made all of this." He stepped into the workshop, running his hand along the rocking chair's arm with unconscious affection. "Hobby, mostly. Keeps my hands busy during the long winters." Sarah moved closer to examine a carved eagle, marveling at the detail in each feather. "This isn't a hobby, this is art." Jake's discomfort with the praise was evident in the way he busied himself straightening already straight tools. "Just woodworking. Nothing fancy. Have you ever sold any of these pieces?" "A few. Dolores has some of my cutting boards in the diner. Made a hope chest for the pastor's daughter when she got married." He shrugged, as if dismissing the significance of his work. "People around here appreciate useful things more than pretty ones." Sarah picked up a jewelry box, admiring the way the wood grain flowed across its surface like water. Inside, she discovered a hidden compartment revealed by pressing a nearly invisible catch. "How long did this take you to make?" "Few months of evenings." Jake watched her explore the box's secrets, and something in his expression softened. "Made it for, well, doesn't matter now. Just sits here collecting dust." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Sarah set the box down gently, understanding that she'd stumbled upon another piece of Jake's complicated past. She must have been very special. Was. The single word carried years of regret and loss. Long time ago now, before Sarah could respond, Tommy's voice called from the house, breaking the intimate moment. Jake stepped back, his usual composure sliding back into place like a familiar mask. "Better see what he needs," Jake said, already moving toward the door. "Screwdriver's on the pegboard there, third hook from the left." Sarah retrieved the tool but lingered in the workshop, trying to reconcile this new dimension of Jake with the practical rancher she thought she knew. The man who'd carved these pieces possessed not just skill, but genuine artistic vision. Yet he lived alone on a ranch, selling his work occasionally, but mostly creating for his own satisfaction. She wondered about the woman the jewelry box had been intended for, about the story Jake clearly wasn't ready to tell. That afternoon, while Jake was checking cattle and Tommy napped, Sarah found herself drawn back to the workshop. She studied each piece more carefully, noting the progression of skill and complexity over what must have been years of dedicated practice. The earlier works showed competence, but not mastery. The newer pieces revealed an artist who'd found his voice through patience and persistence. A leather-bound journal lay open on the workbench, its pages filled with sketches and notes in Jake's careful handwriting. Sarah knew she shouldn't look, but curiosity overcame discretion. The drawings showed various woodworking projects in different stages of planning, with detailed measurements and construction notes. But scattered among the technical drawings were other sketches, landscapes, animals, and increasingly portraits of a woman and child she recognized as herself and Tommy. The realization that Jake had been sketching them sent warmth flooding through her chest. The drawings weren't intrusive or presumptuous. They captured quiet moments with the eye of someone who noticed details others might miss. Tommy feeding chickens, his face serious with concentration. Sarah reading on the front porch, sunlight caught in her hair. Simple scenes rendered with affection and skill. "Mama?" Tommy's sleepy voice called from the house, and Sarah quickly closed the journal, feeling guilty for her invasion of Jake's privacy. But the images stayed with her, evidence that they'd made more of an impression on their taciturn host than his careful courtesy suggested. That evening, Jake taught Tommy to whittle, showing him how to hold the knife safely and work with the wood's natural grain rather than against it. Sarah watched from the kitchen as she prepared dinner, noting the way Jake adjusted his teaching to Tommy's 7-year-old attention span and motor skills. "It's about patience," Jake was saying. "Wood doesn't like to be rushed. You have to work with it, understand what it wants to become." Tommy nodded solemnly, his small hands gripping the knife with careful concentration. "Like when you're making friends. You can't rush that either." Jake paused in his demonstration, looking at the boy with something like surprise. "That's right. Good things take time to grow. Is that why you and Mama talk so careful-like? Because you're still growing into friends?" Sarah's hands stilled on the carrot she was chopping, heat rising in her cheeks. From the mouths of babes came observations that adults tried to dance. "Around something like that," Jake replied, his voice carefully neutral. But when he glanced toward the kitchen window, Sarah caught his eye and saw understanding pass between them. They were indeed growing into something, though neither seemed ready to name what that might be. After dinner, they sat on the porch, as had become their habit. Jake worked on a new carving while Sarah mended one of Tommy's shirts. The domestic scene felt natural now, comfortable in a way that both soothed and worried her. Comfort bred expectation, and expectation led to disappointment when circumstances inevitably changed. "The rocking chair in your workshop," Sarah said during a lull in conversation. "Were you making it for someone special?" Jake's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. "Thought I might be once upon a time. Turned out I was wrong." "What happened?" "She decided she wanted different things than I could offer. City life, career, travel. Can't say I blamed her. Ranch life isn't for everyone." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Sarah heard the old hurt underneath. "Her loss," Sarah said quietly. Jake looked up from his carving, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since they'd started this conversation. "Maybe. Or maybe she was smart enough to know what she wanted while I was content to assume it would work out. And now? Now I know better than to make assumptions about what people want or how long they might want it." The gentle warning in his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Jake Morrison had been hurt before by someone who'd left him behind for greener pastures. He wouldn't make himself that vulnerable again without clear indication that his feelings were reciprocated and his hopes were realistic. Sarah understood the message, even as her heart ached for the pain that had taught him such caution. She also understood that her own feelings were becoming more complicated with each passing day. What had started as gratitude was evolving into something deeper, more dangerous. She was falling in love with this quiet, generous man, but she was also homeless, unemployed, except for part-time waitressing, and responsible for a 7-year-old child. What did she have to offer someone like Jake Morrison, beyond the temporary pleasure of her company? As if sensing her thoughts, Tommy appeared in the doorway wearing his pajamas and carrying Mr. Buttons. "Time for bed, sweetheart," Sarah said, grateful for the interruption. "Will you tell me a story about the horses?" Tommy asked Jake hopefully. Jake set aside his carving and stood. "I think I can manage that." Sarah watched them disappear into the house, her heart full of affection for both the man who made bedtime stories out of ranch life and the boy who'd so easily accepted Jake's presence in their lives. Tommy was adapting to this temporary arrangement with the resilience of childhood, but what would happen when it came time to leave? How could she explain to her son that some gifts were only meant to be borrowed, not kept? The silver locket Jake carried in his pocket, his grandmother's, she'd learned from overheard conversation with Dolores, contained pictures of the family he'd come from and perhaps dreamed of creating. Sarah wondered if there would ever be room in that locket for new pictures, new dreams, or if the past held him too tightly to allow for an uncertain future. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by the rural mail carrier who made the rounds to outlying ranches twice a week. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind Jake's house when she heard the trucks approach, followed by the sound of Jake's boots on the gravel drive. She didn't think much of it until she heard the kitchen door close with unusual force. When she entered the house 20 minutes later, she found Jake standing at the kitchen counter, an unopened envelope in his hands. His usual composure had cracked slightly, revealing tension in the set of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. "Everything all right?" Sarah asked, though clearly it wasn't. Jake looked up as if surprised to find her there. "Letter from my brother. Haven't heard from him in, must be 5 years now." The envelope bore a Denver postmark and expensive-looking letterhead. Sarah could see Jake's full name written in careful script across the front, along with his complete address, information that suggested the sender had gone to some trouble to track him down. "Are you going to open it?" Jake set the letter on the counter as if it might bite him. "Eventually, just wasn't expecting. Marcus only contacts me when he needs something." Sarah had learned enough about Jake's past to know that his relationship with his younger brother was complicated. Marcus Morrison had chosen a different path: college, law school, a successful practice in Denver. From Jake's careful mentions over the past weeks, Sarah understood that the brothers had grown apart over questions of responsibility and family obligation, particularly regarding their aging parents' care. "Tommy's helping Dolores with the lunch. Prep at the diner today," Sarah said gently. "If you want to talk about it." Jake picked up the letter again, turning it over in his weathered hands. "Marcus left for college when he was 18 and never really came back. Visits at Christmas. Calls on birthdays, but..." He trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. "After Dad died, there was some disagreement about the ranch, about what should happen to it." Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee and settled at the table, waiting for Jake to continue if he chose to. "Dad left everything to me," Jake said finally, joining her at the table, but leaving the letter unopened between them. The land, the house, the responsibility. "Marcus felt he should have gotten his share in cash, wanted me to sell and split the proceeds. But you couldn't do that. This place was Dad's life work, his father's before that. Selling felt like betraying everything they'd built." Jake's fingers drummed against the table. "Marcus saw it as me being stubborn and sentimental, said I was choosing dirt over family." The pain in Jake's voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah could hear the years of guilt and regret underneath. Family disputes had a way of festering, creating wounds that never quite healed. "What did you do?" "Bought him out with money I didn't have. Took 15 years to pay off the debt, but he got his inheritance." Jake's laugh held no humor. "Haven't spoken more than 10 words since the papers were signed." Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You did what you thought was right." "Did I? Sometimes I wonder if Marcus was right. If holding on to this place was worth losing my brother over." The confession surprised them both. Jake wasn't a man given to second-guessing his decisions, but the letter had clearly unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "There's only one way to find out what he wants," Sarah said gently. Jake nodded, picked up the envelope, and opened it with the careful precision he brought to everything else. Sarah watched his face as he read, noting the progression from tension to surprise to something that might have been hope. "He's getting married," Jake said finally. "Third time, but he says this one's different. Wants to bring her here to meet me." "That's wonderful." "Is it?" Jake refolded the letter carefully. "Says he's been thinking about family, about the importance of not letting pride stand in the way of relationships. Wants to, how does he put it, heal old wounds and build bridges." Sarah could hear the skepticism in Jake's voice, but she could also detect something else, longing, perhaps, for the brother he'd lost to ambition and misunderstanding. "When does he want to visit?" "Next month. Weekend after the harvest festival." Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land that had cost him so much. "Part of me thinks it's too late, too much water under the bridge. And the other part?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "The other part remembers what it was like to have a brother, someone who knew all the same stories, shared the same memories." He turned back to face her. "What would you do?" The question surprised Sarah. In the weeks she'd been staying at the ranch, Jake had been the one offering guidance and support. To have him ask for her advice felt like a shift in their relationship, an acknowledgement that her opinion mattered. To him, "I'd give him a chance," she said. "Family is too precious to waste on old grievances. Trust me, I know what it's like to lose people you love. If there's a possibility of getting your brother back." Jake studied her face, and Sarah realized she'd revealed more about her own losses than she'd intended. The grief for David was still there, would always be there, but it had evolved from sharp, daily agony to a gentler ache that reminded her how much love she'd been fortunate enough to experience. "You're right," Jake said finally. "I'll write back, tell him they're welcome." The decision seemed to lift some invisible weight from his shoulders. Sarah found herself wondering what Marcus Morrison would make of his brother's current houseguests, whether Jake's healing relationship with his brother would have room for the complications she and Tommy represented. That afternoon, while Jake worked on his reply to Marcus, Sarah threw herself into preparations for the community's annual Harvest Festival. The event was still weeks away, but volunteers were needed for everything from planning to setup, and Sarah had eagerly accepted Dolores's invitation to help with the organizing committee. The festival represented Cedar Ridge at its best, a celebration of community, tradition, and the end of another successful growing season. Sarah had learned that Jake typically participated by donating cattle for the barbecue and helping with setup, but he rarely stayed for the social aspects of the event. The man who carved beautiful birds and taught children to whittle was surprisingly shy when it came to large gatherings. "You should enter some of your woodwork in the craft competition," Sarah suggested when she found him in his workshop that evening, putty knife in hand as he smoothed the final finish on a small table. "Don't need the attention," Jake replied. But she caught the faint flush that colored his neck. "The community would love to see what you create. Some of these pieces are museum quality." Jake set down his tools and looked at her seriously. "Sarah, there's something you should understand about me. I'm not a man who seeks the spotlight, never have been. I'm content to live quietly, help when I can, and let others do the talking. There's nothing wrong with being appreciated for your talents. Maybe not, but I've learned that attention can be complicated. People start expecting things, wanting things." He trailed off, but Sarah understood his meaning. Jake had been hurt by someone who'd wanted him to be different than he was, more ambitious perhaps, more willing to chase success and recognition. "What if I entered something for you?" Sarah found herself saying, "without your name on it, just to see how people respond." Jake considered this, absently running his thumb along the table's smooth edge. "You'd do that? If you'd let me." Something shifted in the air between them, a deepening of trust and understanding that went beyond their careful friendship. Jake was allowing her to advocate for him, to be his representative in a community that meant everything to him. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt significant. "The jewelry box," he said finally. "The one you admired. If you think it's worthy." Sarah smiled, remembering the beautiful piece with its hidden compartments and flowing grain. "It's more than worthy. It's extraordinary." As they worked together that evening, Sarah helping Jake select pieces for the festival, while he explained the techniques and inspiration behind each one, she found herself thinking about the unopened chapters of both their lives. Jake was preparing to reconnect with his estranged brother, while simultaneously allowing her deeper into his private world. She was building a place for herself in this community, while knowing that her circumstances remained precarious. The handwritten letter from Marcus lay on Jake's kitchen counter, answered but not yet mailed, representing possibility and risk in equal measure. Like everything meaningful in life, reconciliation required courage, the willingness to be vulnerable, to hope for better outcomes than past experience suggested. Sarah understood that courage intimately. Every day she stayed at Jake's ranch, every deepening of their friendship, every moment she allowed herself to imagine a permanent place in this life required the same willingness to risk disappointment. But watching Jake carefully wrap his wooden jewelry box for transport to town, seeing the quiet pride he took in work that deserved recognition, she thought perhaps some risks were worth taking. The revelation came by accident, as life-changing discoveries often do. Sarah had been looking for insurance papers to help settle a minor billing dispute with the town doctor when she opened what she thought was a file cabinet in Jake's small home office. Instead, she found herself staring at documents that painted an entirely different picture of the man she thought she knew. Property deeds stretched across 3 counties, investment statements from banks in Denver and Chicago, legal papers establishing Jake Morrison not just as a modest rancher, but as the owner of nearly 10,000 acres of prime Wyoming land, including mineral rights that generated substantial royalties from a natural gas operation she'd never heard him mention. Sarah's hands trembled as she processed what she was seeing. The modest 2-bedroom house, the simple lifestyle, the careful budgeting she'd observed, all of it was choice, not necessity. Jake Morrison was wealthy. Very wealthy. "Find what you were looking for?" Jake's voice from the doorway made her jump, guilt flooding her face as she realized how this must look. "I'm sorry, I was just the insurance papers. You said they were in the filing cabinet." She gestured helplessly at the documents spread before her, unable to form a coherent explanation. Jake stepped into the small room, his expression unreadable, as he took in the scattered papers and Sarah's obvious distress. "I should have been clearer about which cabinet," he said calmly, beginning to gather the documents. "These aren't exactly what you'd call insurance papers." "Jake, I don't understand. This says you own half the county. The mineral rights alone must be worth more than I need," Jake interrupted gently. "More than anyone needs." Sarah sank into the desk chair, her mind reeling. "But you live like... I mean, your house is so simple, and you worry about cattle prices, and you think wealthy people can't live simply?" Jake's tone held no accusation, but Sarah heard the underlying tension. "Or are you wondering why a rich man would take in a desperate woman and her child?" What my real motives might be, the suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. "No, that's not what I..." But even as she protested, she realized that part of her mind was indeed racing through that exact territory. Why would a man of substantial means live so modestly? Why would he open his home to strangers when he could afford any level of comfort or security? Jake finished collecting the papers and locked them back in the correct cabinet. When he turned to face her, his expression was carefully neutral. "My grandfather started buying land during the Depression when people were desperate to sell. My father continued building the holdings, quietly and without fanfare. When oil and gas companies started leasing drilling rights 20 years ago, the royalties became substantial. But you never said anything. All this time I've been worried about being a burden, about the cost of feeding us. And you let you what? Maintain your dignity, contribute what you could, feel like an equal instead of a charity case." Jake's voice remained calm, but Sarah caught the edge underneath. Would you have stayed if you'd known? Would you have let me help if you'd thought? It was just a rich man's whim. Sarah realized he was right, and the knowledge stung. She would have run, pride intact and son in tow, rather than accept what she would have seen as condescending charity from someone who couldn't possibly understand her struggles. That's not the point, she said weakly, isn't it? Jake leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Sarah, I live the way I do because it suits me. Because I learned early that money doesn't buy the things that matter most. Family, community, contentment. I've seen what the pursuit of wealth does to people, how it changes them. Is that what happened with your brother? Jake nodded slowly. Marcus always resented that I inherited the land. Not because he wanted to ranch. He never did, but because he saw dollar signs where I saw legacy. The money from mineral rights started flowing after he'd already left for law school, which made things worse. He felt cheated out of something he'd never wanted in the first place. Sarah was beginning to understand the complexity of Jake's situation. So, you don't tell people about the money. Most folks around here know I do well enough. They see the land, know about the gas leases. But I don't flaunt it, and I don't let it define how I live or who I am. Jake's gaze met hers directly. The question is, does it change how you see me? The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah realized that part of her was indeed struggling with this new information. It wasn't jealousy or disappointment exactly, but a sense of displacement. The careful balance of their relationship, two people helping each other through difficult circumstances, had shifted fundamentally. She was no longer a fellow traveler on hard times. She was a recipient of charity from someone who could afford to be generous without sacrifice. I need some air, Sarah said, standing abruptly. I need to think. Jake stepped aside to let her pass, but his voice followed her. Sarah, nothing's changed. Not really. I'm still the same man who took you in because it was the right thing to do. But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Everything had changed. The man she'd been falling in love with, the modest rancher who lived simply and worked with his hands, was also a wealthy landowner who chose simplicity rather than having it chosen for him. The distinction might seem minor to some, but to Sarah, who'd spent the last year learning the difference between choice and necessity, it felt enormous. She found herself walking toward the barn, needing the familiar comfort of the animals and the honest smell of hay and leather. Tommy was there, as she'd expected, sitting cross-legged in Star's stall while the mare nuzzled his hair. He looked up when she entered, his face bright with 7-year-old enthusiasm. Mama, Jake said, I can help with the evening feeding. He's teaching me how to measure the grain properly, so each horse gets exactly what they need. Sarah forced a smile, struck by the innocence of her son's pleasure in these simple tasks. Tommy didn't care about property deeds or mineral rights. He cared about horses that knew his name and a man who took time to teach him things worth knowing. That's wonderful. Sweetheart, Tommy studied her face with the perceptiveness children sometimes displayed. Are you sad about something? Just thinking, baby. Adult stuff. Is it about Jake? Tommy's question was direct in the way only children could manage. Did you have a fight? Not a fight exactly. More like a misunderstanding. Tommy nodded, sagely, as if misunderstandings between adults were a common phenomenon in his experience. Jake says misunderstandings happen when people make assumptions instead of asking questions. Maybe you should ask him some questions. From the mouths of babes. Sarah sat down beside her son, drawing comfort from his uncomplicated wisdom. What kind of questions? Like, what's most important to him? What makes him happy? What makes him sad? Tommy ticked off the suggestions on his small fingers. Jake told me those are the questions that help you really know someone. Sarah realized that despite weeks of living in Jake's home, sharing meals and conversations and quiet evenings, she'd been making assumptions about who he was based on external evidence rather than asking the deeper questions that might have revealed the full picture. She'd seen the modest house and assumed modest means. She'd observed his simple lifestyle and concluded it was born of necessity rather than choice. What did she really know about Jake Morrison's dreams, his fears, his definition of success? What had she assumed about his motivations for helping her, and how much of that assumption was based on her own need to feel worthy of assistance rather than dependent on charity? As if summoned by her thoughts, Jake appeared in the barn doorway. He moved slowly, as if approaching a skittish animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Tommy, think you could check on the water troughs for me? Make sure they're all full." Tommy scrambled to his feet, eager to help. "Can I use the hose?" "Me myself? Sure thing. Just remember to turn it off tight when you're finished." When they were alone, Jake settled beside Sarah on the straw-covered floor, leaving enough space between them to signal respect for her obvious need to process what she'd learned. "I should have told you," he said simply. "About the land, the money, all of it. I like being seen for who I am, rather than what I have." Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him. The same weathered hands that carved beautiful birds and taught her son to whittle. The same quiet strength that had carried Tommy to safety and offered shelter without conditions. The same gentle eyes that had seen her desperation and responded with kindness rather than judgment. "Who are you, Jake?" she asked, echoing Tommy's suggested questions. "What's most important to you?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm a man who learned that having more than you creates responsibility to use it well. I'm someone who believes that land is meant to be stewarded, not exploited. I'm a person who'd rather live simply and sleep well than accumulate wealth I can't take with me." He paused, then continued more softly. "And I'm someone who's been alone too long, who found something precious when he least expected it, and who's terrified of losing it because of things that shouldn't matter but somehow do." The honesty in his voice broke through Sarah's confusion and hurt. This was still Jake, the man who made coffee every morning and carved toys for her son and created beauty with patient hands. The money didn't change his character. It simply added another layer to a story more complex than she'd understood. "The deed in your filing cabinet," Sarah said carefully. "It shows property extending almost to the county line. 3 generations of buying land from people who needed to sell," Jake confirmed. "Most of it grazing lease now, some of it conservation easement. I don't use it all. Couldn't if I wanted to. And you're planning to leave it to Tommy and me." The words came out as a statement rather than a question, because suddenly she understood the magnitude of what she'd seen in those legal documents. Jake's silence confirmed her suspicion. Somewhere in that stack of papers had been a will, recently revised, that named Sarah and Tommy as beneficiaries to an estate worth millions of dollars. The revelation should have been overwhelming, but instead, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity. Jake Morrison wasn't trying to buy her affection or obligation. He was a man who'd found something worth protecting and was quietly making provisions to ensure its security, regardless of whether his feelings were reciprocated. It was, she realized, exactly what a man of his character would do. The harvest festival was 3 days away when Jake made his decision. Sarah found him in his workshop that evening, carefully polishing a small wooden box she'd never seen before. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Inlaid woods, forming an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. But it was what lay inside the box that made her breath catch. 2 wedding rings rested on faded velvet, their gold surfaces worn smooth by years of wear. They were simple bands, unadorned but beautiful in their plainness, speaking of a love that had valued substance over show. "They were my parents," Jake said, without looking up from his polishing. "Married 47 years before Dad passed. Mom wore hers until the day she died." Sarah remained in the doorway, sensing the significance of this moment without fully understanding it. "They're beautiful." Jake closed the box carefully, his large hands gentle with the precious contents. "Been thinking about what you said. about taking chances, about not letting pride stand in the way of what matters. Something in his tone made Sarah's heart begin to race. She stepped into the workshop, drawn by an invisible current toward this. A man who'd become the center of her world without her quite realizing when it had happened. Jake, let me say this before I lose my nerve. He set the box aside and turned to face her fully. I know our situation is complicated. I know you came here desperate, and I had everything you needed. I know that makes it hard to sort out what's real from what's gratitude or convenience. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Jake held up a gentle hand. I also know that I'm 52 years old and set in my ways, that I live 15 miles from the nearest neighbor and sometimes go days without talking to another soul, that I'm not the kind of man who sweeps women off their feet or makes grand romantic gestures. Jake, what are you? I'm saying that despite all of that, despite every logical reason why this is foolish and premature and probably doomed to disappointment, I've fallen in love with you, Sarah Matthews, with your strength and your dignity, and the way you love that boy of yours, with your laugh when you think no one's listening, and your stubbornness when you think you're being a burden. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned, like everything else about Jake Morrison. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, emotions she'd been holding in check for weeks, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. I've fallen in love with Tommy too, Jake continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was confessing. With his questions and his curiosity and the way he sees wonder in ordinary things. I've fallen in love with the sound of voices in my house and the way it feels to matter to someone again. Jake, Sarah's voice broke on his name. The festival's Saturday night. There's going to be dancing and music and half the county there to see and be seen. I thought. He picked up the wooden box again, his fingers tracing its smooth surface. I thought maybe you'd let me ask you proper-like, in front of people who matter to both of us now. Not because you owe me anything, or because you need security, but because we choose each other. The proposal wasn't a proposal yet, Sarah realized. It was Jake Morrison laying his heart bare, offering her the chance to say yes or no before he made himself vulnerable in front of their entire community. It was characteristic of his thoughtfulness, his respect for her dignity and autonomy. The rings, she managed, would only be offered if you thought you might want to wear one, if you thought Tommy might want to share my name as well as my home. Jake's voice grew softer. I know it's soon. I know we haven't talked about love or forever or any of the things people usually discuss before they consider marriage, but sometimes life doesn't follow the usual timeline. Sarah felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the safe ground of uncertainty behind her, and the unknown territory of commitment stretching ahead. 3 months ago, she'd been sleeping in a broken truck with $17 to her name. Now, a good man was offering her not just security, but partnership, family, a place to belong. What about your brother's visit? She asked, seizing on practical concerns to give herself time to think. Marcus and his fiancée will be here next weekend. All the more reason to make our intentions clear, Jake replied. I won't have Marcus thinking you're some temporary arrangement or that Tommy doesn't belong here permanently. The protectiveness in Jake's voice when he spoke of Tommy nearly undid her. This man had claimed her son in his heart as surely as he'd claimed her, and the knowledge filled spaces in her chest she hadn't realized were empty. I need to think, Sarah said finally. Not about my feelings. I think we both know where those stand. But about timing, about what's fair to you, about whether Jake crossed to her then, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Something that might influence your thinking. She looked up into his weathered face, seeing both hope and fear warring in his expression. The will you saw in my filing cabinet, that wasn't charity or presumption on my part. It was insurance. If something happens to me, I wanted to know that you and Tommy would be secure, that this place would go to people who'd love it the way it deserves. But we're not even. Family is more than blood or legal documents, Jake interrupted gently. You became family the moment I realized I'd rather share my life than protect it. Tommy became my son the first time he looked at me with trust instead of fear. Sarah felt the last of her resistance crumble. This wasn't about money or security or convenience. This was about love in its purest form. The kind that sees need and responds without calculation, that offers itself without guarantee of return. "Ask me," she whispered. "Saturday night? In front of everyone? Saturday night." Jake's smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of careful solitude and replacing them with joy, so pure it took Sarah's breath away. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "There's one more thing," he said, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. "Tommy already knows what I'm planning." "What?" Sarah laughed despite herself. "When did you talk to Tommy?" "Yesterday, when you were in town. Figured I should ask his permission before I asked his mother. Man to man, you understand." "And what did he say?" "Said it was about time I stopped being so slow about it. Apparently, a 7-year-old could see what was happening between us before we figured it out ourselves." The laughter that bubbled up from Sarah's chest felt like champagne, effervescent and intoxicating. "He's been asking me for weeks when you were going to marry us. I kept telling him it didn't work that way. Turns out he was right, and we were overthinking it." They stood together in the workshop, surrounded by the evidence of Jake's patient creativity, holding hands like teenagers and grinning at each other with the giddy relief of people who'd finally stopped fighting the inevitable. "I should warn you," Sarah said, her practical nature reasserting itself. "I come with complications. A son who'll want to know why his new father doesn't live in town like other kids' dads. Medical bills from Tommy's father's illness that will take years to pay off. A complete lack of experience being a rancher's wife." "And I should warn you," Jake replied, "that I come with 10,000 acres of land that needs tending, a brother who's been estranged for 5 years and might not approve of my choices, and a complete lack of experience being anyone's husband or father. We're quite a pair." "We are indeed." The next 3 days passed in a blur of festival preparations and barely contained anticipation. Sarah threw herself into helping Dolores coordinate the food vendors, while Jake worked with the other men to set up the bandstand and dance floor in the town square. Tommy was beside himself with excitement, divided between the novelty of a community celebration and the secret knowledge that Saturday night would bring more than just music and dancing. The people of Cedar Ridge seemed to sense that something significant was brewing. Sarah caught knowing looks from the women at the organizing meetings, saw the speculative glances between Jake and herself when they appeared together at Murphy's store. Small towns had ways of recognizing love before the people involved were ready to announce it. On Friday evening, Sarah stood before the mirror in Jake's guest room. Her room, though the distinction felt increasingly meaningless, trying to decide what to wear to the most important night of her life. The few dresses she owned were practical things, purchased for job interviews and church services, nothing that seemed adequate for a marriage proposal. A soft knock interrupted her deliberations. She opened the door to find Dolores holding a garment bag and wearing an expression of maternal determination. "Thought you might need this," the older woman said, pushing past Sarah into the room. "Belonged to my daughter before she moved to California, and decided ranching wasn't sophisticated enough for her tastes." Inside the bag was a dress that took Sarah's breath away, deep blue silk that would bring out her eyes, cut simply but elegantly, the kind of dress that would make a woman feel beautiful without trying too hard. "Dolores, I can't." "Course you and can. Been hanging in my closet for 3 years waiting for someone who'd appreciate it." Dolores's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Besides, figure I owe Jake Morrison more than one favor over the years. Man's been the backbone of this community since he arrived, even if he's too modest to admit it." "How did you know?" "Honey, everyone in town knows Jake's planning to propose tomorrow night. Question is whether you're planning to say yes." Sarah held the dress against herself, studying her reflection. "What do you think?" "I think that man's been alone too long. and you've been carrying the world on your shoulders without help. I think Tommy needs a father who'll teach him to be a good man, and Jake needs a family to remind him why life's worth living." Dolores reached over and adjusted the dress's neckline. "Mostly, I think love doesn't come around so often that we can afford to let pride or fear chase it away." As Dolores left, promising to return Saturday afternoon to help with hair and makeup, Sarah hung the dress carefully in the closet and tried to imagine herself wearing it tomorrow night. Tried to picture Jake's face when he saw her, the moment when he'd kneel in front of their entire community and offer her his heart along with his name. The wedding ring sat in its wooden box on Jake's dresser, waiting for tomorrow night's ceremony. Sarah fell asleep thinking about those simple gold bands and the 47 years of love they represented, wondering if she and Jake might be fortunate enough to create a similar legacy of their own. The Cedar Ridge town square had been transformed into something magical. String lights crisscrossed between the old oak trees, their warm glow competing with the first stars emerging in the autumn sky. The bandstand, decorated with cornstalks and pumpkins, hosted a local country band whose fiddle and guitar filled the air with melodies that spoke of harvest time and home. Long tables groaned under the weight of covered dishes, contributed by every family in the county, the kind of community feast that reminded everyone why small towns endured despite the pull of distant cities. Sarah stood at the edge of the festivities, her hands smoothing the silk of Dolores's daughter's dress for the 10th time in as many minutes. The deep blue fabric moved like water in the gentle breeze, and she felt transformed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with the anticipation thrumming through her veins. Tommy raced past with a group of children, his face sticky with apple cider and his hair mussed from games of tag around the bandstand. He caught sight of her and skidded to a stop, his eyes wide with 7-year-old appreciation. "Mama! You look like a princess," he breathed, then glanced around conspiratorially. "Is Jake gonna ask you tonight? We'll see, sweetheart." Sarah couldn't suppress the smile that seemed to have taken permanent residence on her face. "Are you having fun?" "The best fun ever. Mrs. Henderson taught me to square dance, and Mr. Murphy let me help with the apple bobbing, and Jake said after the important thing happens, we can stay up past bedtime to watch the fireworks." The important thing had taken on mythical proportions in Tommy's mind over the past 3 days. Sarah could see him practically vibrating with the effort to keep Jake's secret, proud beyond measure to be included in such grown-up planning. Across the square, she spotted Jake emerging from behind the bandstand, where he'd been helping with last-minute sound equipment. He'd traded his usual work clothes for dark jeans and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the silver threading through his dark hair. When their eyes met across the crowd, his smile was tender and nervous and absolutely devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen," the band leader called from the stage, "we're gonna slow things down a bit for all you couples out there. This one's for dancing close and holding tight." The opening notes of a classic waltz drifted across the square, and couples began gravitating toward the designated dance area. Sarah watched Jake make his way through the crowd toward her, noting how people stepped aside with respectful nods and knowing smiles. Word had spread, as word always did in small communities, and half the town seemed to be holding its collective breath. "Dance with me?" Jake asked when he reached her, offering his hand with old-fashioned courtesy. Sarah placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the gentle strength that had become her anchor. "I'd be honored." They moved together onto the makeshift dance floor, Jake's hand settling at her waist while she rested her palm against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her fingers, steady but faster than usual, and realized that despite his outward calm, he was as nervous as she was. "You look beautiful," he murmured, as they began to move to the music. "That dress, Lord, Sarah, you take my breath away." Dolores lent it to me, said it was waiting for someone who'd appreciate it. "Remind me to thank her." Jake's eyes never left her face as they swayed together. "You nervous?" Terrified, Sarah admitted. "You?" "Same. But the good kind of terrified. The kind that means something important is about to happen." Around them, other couples moved to the music, but Sarah was aware only of Jake's hands guiding her, his familiar scent of soap and wood shavings, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious and unexpected. The community that had welcomed her, the friends who'd become family, the life she'd built from nothing, all of it centered on this moment, this man, this choice to believe in happiness again. As the song neared its end, Sarah became aware of a subtle shift in the crowd around them. Other dancers had gradually moved to the edges of the floor, leaving her and Jake in a circle of space that felt both intimate and exposed. The band leader caught Jake's eye and nodded, a signal that made Sarah's heart skip. "Sarah," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. The music had stopped, but he continued to hold her, his eyes serious and full of love. "Before I say what I came here to say, I need you to know something." The entire festival seemed to hold its breath. Sarah was aware of faces turned toward them, of Tommy pushing to the front of the crowd with Dolores's steadying hand on his shoulder, of the expectant hush that had fallen over their community. "You don't owe me anything," Jake continued, his voice strong despite the emotion underlying it. "Not gratitude, not obligation, not anything at all. What I'm about to ask, I'm asking because I can't imagine my life without you and Tommy in it. Because you've brought light to places in my heart I thought were permanently dark." Jake released her hands and stepped back, then slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee in the center of the dance floor. The collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible, but Sarah heard only the sound of her own heartbeat as Jake reached into his pocket and withdrew the small wooden box she'd seen in his workshop. "Sarah Matthews," he said, opening the box to reveal his parents' simple gold bands gleaming in the string light. "Will you marry me? Will you let me be Tommy's father and your husband? Will you build a life with me on land that's waited too long for the sound of family?" Time seemed suspended in that moment between question and answer. Sarah looked down at Jake kneeling before her, this good man who'd opened his home and heart without reservation, and felt the weight of not just her own future, but Tommy's pressing upon her shoulders. Around them, the entire community of Cedar Ridge waited in respectful silence, their faces reflecting hope and anticipation. "Yes," Sarah whispered. Then louder, her voice carrying across the square. "Yes, Jake Morrison, yes to all of it." The cheer that erupted from the crowd was deafening. Jake's face transformed with relief and joy as he rose to his feet, taking Sarah's trembling left hand and sliding his mother's ring onto her finger. The simple gold band fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 40 years for this moment, for this woman, for this love that had grown quietly in the shadow of hardship and bloomed in the light of acceptance. Before Sarah could fully process what had happened, she was swept into Jake's arms, lifted off her feet as he spun her around while the crowd applauded and whistled their approval. When he set her down, his hands framed her face gently, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "I love you," he said. The words meant only for her, despite the audience surrounding them. "I love you too," Sarah replied, marveling at how natural the words felt, how right this moment was, despite its public nature. Tommy broke free from Dolores's gentle restraint and launched himself at both of them, his small arms encircling their waists as he bounced with excitement. "Does this mean I get to call you Dad?" he asked Jake, his face turned up hopefully. Jake knelt again, this time to meet Tommy at eye level. "If you want to, son, nothing would make me happier." "Dad," Tommy tried the word out, testing its weight and finding it good. "Dad! I have a dad." Again! The joy in the boy's voice brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes and sent another wave of approval through the watching crowd. This wasn't just a marriage they were witnessing. It was the creation of a family, the healing of wounds that had seemed permanent, the triumph of hope over despair. Dolores appeared at Sarah's elbow, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Well, that's settled then," she said briskly, but her voice betrayed her emotion. "Pastor Williams, you still got that license you keep in your truck for emergencies?" Pastor Williams, a gentleman in his 70s who'd married half the couples in the county, stepped forward with a bemused smile. "Are you suggesting we make this official right now?" "Why wait?" Jake asked, looking to Sarah for confirmation. "If you're willing, if Pastor Williams doesn't mind, this community's been our witness for the proposal. Seems fitting they should witness the ceremony too." Sarah's practical mind immediately began cataloguing all the reasons why getting married at a harvest festival without preparation or formal ceremony was impractical. No wedding dress, no flowers, no proper vows written out, no... "Yes," she heard herself saying, cutting off her own internal protests. "Yes, let's do it now, tonight, here." The crowd erupted again, this time with a different energy. The bustling excitement of a community mobilizing to create something beautiful on short notice. Within minutes, arrangements were being made with the efficient choreography of people who'd worked together for years. Someone produced white ribbon to mark off a proper aisle between the tables. The women who'd contributed to the feast began arranging wildflowers and autumn leaves into impromptu decorations. The band huddled together, discussing appropriate music for an impromptu wedding ceremony. "Sarah, honey," Dolores called, "we need to get you properly prepared. Can't have you married in good conscience without at least fixing your hair and maybe adding some flowers." Sarah found herself swept away by a group of women who'd appointed themselves her impromptu bridal party. They led her to the church fellowship, hall across the street, where willing hands arranged her hair into an elegant updo and wove small white flowers, someone's contribution from their late-season garden, into the style. Lipstick appeared from various purses, and someone produced a delicate lace handkerchief that had belonged to her grandmother for Sarah to carry. When she emerged from the fellowship hall 20 minutes later, the transformation of the town square took her breath away. The community had created a wedding venue that rivaled anything a professional planner might have designed. A proper aisle stretched between the tables, marked with mason jars filled with flowers and battery-operated candles. The bandstand had been decorated with white fabric and more autumn flowers, creating a beautiful backdrop for the ceremony. Jake waited at the end of the aisle, flanked by Pastor Williams and several of the men who'd become his close friends over the years. He'd managed to find a tie somewhere, probably borrowed from someone in the crowd, and his hair had been combed into submission. But it was his expression that made Sarah's heart skip, wonder and love and gratitude all mixed together in a look that was just for her. Tommy stood beside Jake, practically vibrating with excitement, holding a small pillow that someone had quickly fashioned to carry the second ring. The family Bible Pastor Williams used for all his ceremonies was open in his weathered hands, its pages fluttering slightly in the autumn breeze. "Ready?" Dolores asked, offering Sarah her arm since there was no father to walk her down the aisle. Sarah looked at the scene before her, the man she loved waiting patiently, the community that had embraced her gathered in celebration, the son who would finally have the father he deserved, and felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced since before David's death. "Ready?" she said, and stepped forward into her new life. 6 months later, Sarah Morrison stood at the kitchen window of what was now undeniably her home, watching her husband teach their son to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the previous night's storm. The scene had become as familiar as breathing. Jake's patient instruction, Tommy's eager attention, the easy collaboration between man and boy that spoke of bonds deeper than blood. The morning sun caught the gold band on her finger, the same ring that had once symbolized Jake's mother's 47-year marriage and now began the count of her own. 6 months, 2 weeks and 3 days since Pastor Williams had pronounced them husband and wife under the string lights of the harvest festival, with half the county as witness and autumn stars as blessing. The transformation of their life together had been as natural as changing seasons. Tommy had adapted to ranch life with the resilience of childhood, his vocabulary now peppered with terms like water gap and head count and mineral supplement. He'd grown 2 inches and gained 15 pounds of healthy muscle from outdoor work and Sarah's determined efforts to make up for the lean months of their journey west. More importantly, he'd regained the confidence of a child who knew he was wanted, loved, and permanently secure. Sarah's own transformation had been more subtle but no less profound. The desperate woman who'd arrived in Cedar Ridge, clutching $17 and a fading hope, had evolved into someone she barely recognized. A rancher's wife who could discuss cattle prices and weather patterns with equal facility, who organized community fundraisers and coordinated volunteer schedules with the efficiency of a natural leader. The community had not merely accepted her, they'd embraced her as an essential part of their social fabric. Her role at the diner had evolved as, well, Dolores had made her assistant manager within 3 months, recognizing both her competence and her natural way with people. The work provided Sarah with independent income and a sense of contribution that went beyond her domestic responsibilities, maintaining the dignity that had always been important to her sense of self. On the kitchen counter, a new family portrait sat in a handcrafted frame, one of Jake's creations, naturally. The photograph had been taken at Christmas, the 3 of them arranged in front of the fireplace with expressions that radiated contentment rather than the careful optimism that had characterized their earlier interactions. Tommy grinned gap-toothed between his parents, having lost his first tooth to an apple from their own orchard. Jake's arm encircled both his wife and son with the possessive protectiveness of a man who'd waited too long for family and intended to treasure every moment. Sarah's smile in the photograph was unguarded in a way that surprised even her, the expression of someone who'd stopped waiting for disaster to strike. The portrait represented more than documentation of their happiness. It symbolized the permanence they'd all craved but been afraid to claim. The house bore evidence of their merged existence everywhere, Tommy's drawings magneted to the refrigerator, Sarah's books scattered throughout the living room, Jake's latest woodworking project taking shape on the kitchen table, where it could be admired and discussed during meals. A gentle knock at the front door interrupted Sarah's morning contemplation. She opened it to find Marcus Morrison standing on the porch, his expensive suit looking incongruous against the backdrop of ranch country, but his smile genuine and warm. "Good morning, sister-in-law," he said, the title still carrying the novelty of recent relationship. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Never," Sarah replied, stepping aside to welcome him in. Marcus's visit the previous month had exceeded everyone's expectations. The reconciliation between the brothers had been tentative at first, marked by careful conversation and avoided topics, but Tommy's uninhibited affection for his new uncle had broken through decades of accumulated hurt with the efficiency that only children possess. "Coffee's fresh," Sarah offered, leading him toward the kitchen. "Jake and Tommy are out by the south pasture if you want to join them." "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you first." Marcus accepted the offered mug, inhaling the rich aroma, appreciatively. "About the conversation Jake and I had yesterday." Sarah settled across from him at the table, curious about the serious tone that had entered his voice. The brothers had been talking privately more frequently since Marcus's engagement had evolved into actual wedding plans, discussions that seemed to revolve around family responsibility and legacy preservation. "He told you about the trust fund?" Marcus continued when Sarah nodded. "The one he's establishing for Tommy's education." Sarah had learned about Jake's latest financial planning the previous week, a substantial fund designated specifically for Tommy's future schooling, whether that proved to be college, trade school, or whatever path the boy eventually chose to pursue. The gesture was characteristic of Jake's thoughtful approach to family obligation, ensuring that opportunities would exist regardless of changing circumstances. "He mentioned it," Sarah confirmed. "It's incredibly generous, but then your brother has redefined my understanding of generosity." Marcus smiled, genuine affection warming his expression. Jake always was the brother with the bigger heart. Took me too many years to appreciate that quality instead of resenting it. And now I'm grateful my stubbornness didn't cost us the chance to be family again. Marcus grew serious. Sarah, I wanted you to know that watching Jake with you and Tommy has been educational. I've never seen him so content, so genuinely happy. You've given him something I didn't think he'd ever allow himself to have again. He's given us everything. Sarah replied simply, safety, love, belonging, a future worth believing in. That's exactly what I mean. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Jake spent 20 years taking care of everyone else. His parents, the ranch, the community, even me, when I was too prideful to accept help gracefully. But he never took care of his own happiness. You've changed that. Through the window, they could see Jake and Tommy walking back toward the house, their heads bent in conversation about whatever project had occupied their morning. Tommy carried Jake's spare hammer with the casual competence of someone who belonged exactly where he was, while Jake's hand rested lightly on the boy's shoulder in a gesture of protection and affection that had become second nature. He's a father, Sarah observed, watching her husband and son approach, better than I dared hope for when I accepted his proposal. And you're exactly the partner he needed, even if he was too modest to believe he deserved someone wonderful. Marcus stood as the front door opened, admitting the sound of male voices and muddy boots being respectfully removed. Uncle Marcus, Tommy's delighted voice carried from the entryway. Did you see how straight I hammered those nails? Dad says I'm getting really good at it. The easy use of Dad still brought a smile to Sarah's face, even after months of hearing it. Tommy had claimed Jake as his father, with the wholehearted acceptance that children brought to relationships that felt right, and Jake had embraced the role with equal naturalness as her husband and son entered the kitchen, bringing with them the scent of morning air and honest work. Sarah reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed a desperate night in a broken truck into this life of abundance and joy. The faded family photograph she'd once clutched as her only remaining hope had been replaced by new images. Wedding pictures, holiday celebrations, candid moments of ordinary happiness that felt extraordinary for their simple authenticity. The wooden cross above the kitchen door caught the morning light, its plain surface representing the faith that had sustained Jake through years of solitude and guided him toward the moment when he'd chosen to open his door to strangers. That same faith had carried Sarah through her darkest hours and delivered her to a place where hope was no longer a luxury, but a daily reality. "What's the plan for today?" Jake asked, accepting Sarah's kiss of greeting with the comfortable affection of a man who never tired of being welcomed home. "Actually," Marcus interjected, "I was hoping we could discuss wedding plans. Jennifer and I have decided on a date, and we'd like the ceremony to be here, on the ranch, if you'll have us." Jake's smile reflected the deep satisfaction of a man whose home had become the center of family celebration rather than a refuge from solitude. Nothing would make us happier. As the conversation turned to wedding planning and family coordination, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet gratitude for the circuitous path that had led them all to this kitchen table, this shared future, this understanding that sometimes the most precious gifts come disguised as desperate circumstances. The morning stretched ahead with its familiar rhythms of work and conversation, planning and dreaming, the ordinary magic of people who'd chosen each other and committed to building something lasting together. Outside, the ranch continued its patient existence under the Wyoming sky, waiting for whatever seasons would come, secure in the knowledge that it was finally, completely home.